Welcome to the weekly Women's GMO-Free News Hangout. And today I'm co-host Andi Frostad, or the host, I guess, now today. And we have with us our Kathleen. Actually, I'm going to have you go ahead and introduce yourself to start.
Okay. My name is Kathleen Halal. I'm one of the co-founders of Moms Cross America March, where we're planning to have moms and also anyone who's interested in labeling join in to every 4th of July parade across the nation and wear our t-shirts or any t-shirts and pass out flyers and pass out samples of organic food and hold banners and march in the parade along with everyone else asking for labeling. Mothers are leading the way out of our concern for the health of our children. But anyone is welcome to join who's interested in labeling GMOs.
That is okay. And then our co-host, go have you introduce yourself, Lori. Okay.
I was muted. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm Lori Olson from Port Orchard, Washington, and I'm a volunteer. I've worked with a lot of different groups, so I'm kind of in between jobs right now because we've got the Yes On Initiative 522 coming up, and they're still getting everything going with that. That's it.
Okay, and I'd like to welcome our second guest, and that is Howard Vlieger. He's a third-generation Iowa farmer who works on the farm still with his son is following in his footsteps, and he serves on the board of directors for the Farm and Ranch Freedom Alliance and the Food Freedom Foundation, and is president and co-founder of Variety Farms, which has a successful biological crop production program. And he began studying GMO crops in 1994 and is fortunate to have ongoing involvement with some of the lead scientists in the world on research projects involving GMO crops. So this, combined with his real-life experience, gives him a unique perspective on GMOs. And so welcome to our Google Hangout today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The one footnote I would give you, I am no longer president of Variety Farms, so
Okay.
I stepped down from that a while back. So,
All right.
but glad to be with you.
Well, thank you.
Howard,
so,
just
go ahead,
one
Lori.
second. Howard, can you do me a favor and pronounce your name, because how you pronounce your last name, because I've heard it pronounced many different ways.
Well, then there's obviously no way to pronounce it wrong. Vlieger is the way that I pronounce it.
Vlieger. Okay.
Vlieger, yes.
Okay.
All right. So Howard, I just want to start right in with these Zen Honeycutt had on her website a corn comparison. It was between GE corn and non-GE corn. And I'm wondering, how are you involved with that, or you're familiar with that? And can you tell us a little bit about that comparison data?
I am familiar with it, though those samples were taken from side-by-side fields in the Midwest from the 2012 crop year. They were collected pre-harvest. A third party went out and collected those samples in the exact same manner from the side-by-side fields. The only thing separating the fields was the fence row. And they shelled the grain off of the cob. They sent the samples to the lab for the analysis that you see reported. And the field that had the GMO corn in it has been in a glyphosate-based herbicide program for 10 years. The last 5 years it has been corn on corn, and it has been Roundup Ready corn every year. The non-GMO corn was the field that the non-GMO corn was collected from has been 5 years since there's been any glyphosate-based herbicide used on that field. And when the third party that collected those samples sent them in, it was because they had a customer that wanted corn that would test to be free of glyphosate residue to put into the food supply. And when they ran the analysis in the lab, and they were just testing for the glyphosate, but they were using a GC mass spec machine in doing this analysis, and that machine has the ability to test for a wide variety of different compounds. As the analysis was running, the technician thought that they recognized another compound in there in a significant level. So the technician reran the sample and had selected both glyphosate and formaldehyde on the second running of that sample. That is when the results came as they have been published and circulated on, or posted on, the mom's website, and those results I've seen them in a lot of different places on the internet, and they are accurate.
Okay, so were those, was that test repeated on different locations, on different farmers' fields, or is this from one farmer?
Those are from separate farming operations. The GMO corn is from one farmer, and the non-GMO corn is from his neighbor right across the fence. And there is additional sampling. Now, of course, harvest is long past, but there is efforts underway. There are efforts underway to collect additional samples that can be identified as GMO and non-GMO, and as much as possible specific by variety, if that is the case, where one variety was put in one grain bin and another variety in another grain bin. And there will be additional testing conducted. We're working on a number of different things in that regard.
So this data was repeated several times from that same field.
No.
And it wasn't just.
No, it's just the two samples.
The two samples
that you see, one from one side of the fence and one from the other side of the fence.
Okay. So when they got those high readings, did they run that through again, several times to confirm that that data was correct?
The technician was certain of the results when they saw it.
Okay. Well, I find this information quite alarming. And was the corn in these fields, they're not test plots. They're actually for feed or going towards food. For one or the other. So this is what we could be consuming is corn that has 200 parts per million of formaldehyde.
And as I said, if I said or I did or didn't say it, the reason that the third party was doing this test is because they wanted to find corn that would test to be free of any glyphosate residue. The glyphosate residue in the sample that also had the formaldehyde in it was at 13 parts per million. 13 parts per million glyphosate residue in corn is the EPA's legal tolerance limit for glyphosate residue in corn.
Okay, so that was just kind of a fluky thing. What you said earlier is just finding this formaldehyde results was just sort of just kind of fell upon it.
It was, as I said, it was because the technician believed that they recognized the compound, which ended up being the formaldehyde. So they reran it with that programmed in. When you run a sample through a GC mass spec machine, it analyzes for a very wide array of different compounds and minerals, and it only reports the ones that you have selected.
Yeah, and that just kind of, you wouldn't know what to test for when you're testing these crops. I mean, you wouldn't think of checking for formaldehyde levels. But going back to the glyphosate, that is 13 parts per million. And you said that's the EPA's limit. Has that always been the EPA's limit, or has that changed in the past? Or
it was raised in 2011.
It was raised in 2011?
May 11 of 2011. I just was doing some research on this last night prior to doing a radio program interview conversation today on WHO radio out of Des Moines. And, excuse me, the glyphosate residue limit in corn prior to May of 2011 was 6.5 parts, or 6 parts per million, excuse me, not 6.5.
So this is more than double.
It was raised to 13 for one reason. That request was submitted by Monsanto to the EPA. That was the reason the EPA increased that limit. We have seen that limit of glyphosate residue in grain in the United States. Originally, it was at 0.1 or a tenth of a part per million. So it has been raised, depending on what feedstuff you're looking at. On soybeans, it's 20 parts per million.
Wow.
Corn, it's 13 parts per million. Sweet corn, it's 3.5 parts per million. Corn silage, it's 200 parts per million. Roundup Ready alfalfa, it's 400 parts per million. Excuse me.
Wow, that's high.
Where is there a place that we can go to get this information? You know, have it listed all out for us so we can have a look at it too and know about that?
Go to the EPA's website, and you'll have to do some digging and searching, and you'll find this information there. And the thing that's the most concerning about this to us, there has been scientific studies completed and conducted that documents the fact that it only takes a tenth of a part per million of glyphosate residue in the foodstuffs that has been fed to livestock that significantly damages the beneficial microflora, or the good bugs, in the digestive tract of the livestock. And in the case of the study that Dr. Kruger has completed in Germany, it either significantly damages or wipes out 3 beneficial microorganisms that are the control organisms for the Clostridium botulinum organism. When the Clostridium botulinum organism goes unchecked, that allows both acute and chronic botulism to have a free reign. And this problem is severe in Germany because of the fact it's more severe there than it may be in other parts of the world, simply because of their climate and the conditions they have with weather. There's pictures that Dr. Kruger has in one of her PowerPoint presentations, which Kathleen, if you remember the picture of the milk cows laying dead
I saw
all over in the PowerPoint that I gave when I was in California. Well, people say, well, that can't be happening in our country because, you know, one gentleman made the comment, he says, well, if this is true, my cows would all be dead. And I said to the gentleman who told me that, I says, I hope and pray that he doesn't receive the weather conditions like they have in Germany, or his prediction could come true. The most concerning thing about this that I have heard about in our country was a story that Dr. McNeil relayed to me earlier this winter. We were at a meeting together, and he has, as a number of us have gone out and given the education presentations based on a lot of the information that Dr. Huber has accumulated and put together. And he was out in the Northeast, in the New England states, giving a presentation. And a gentleman came up to him afterwards and he says, I'm having problems with my dairy cows. Could you possibly come and look at them? Well, Dr. McNeil he worked at Fort Detrick in Maryland when he was in the Army. He and Dr. Huber were actually there at the same time. And they both worked in the bioterrorism segments, and they knew a lot about disease identification. Well, Dr. McNeil goes to this dairy farm, and while they're standing there looking at the cows, excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. I'm going to try to drown it. While they were standing there looking at the cows, one of them dropped dead. And the gentleman started crying. And Dr. McNeil thought, this man is really connected to his cows. Well, the thing that he started crying about, this was the grandfather, I believe, and the father, which it was grandfather, father, and then the third generation is a young son who was between 4 and 5 years old. The grandfather was crying, and Dr. McNeil tried to console him, and he says, well, my grandson is in the hospital, and they cannot figure out what's wrong with him. So Dr. McNeil asked him what his symptoms were, and he told him. And after he told Dr. McNeil the symptoms, Dr. McNeil said to him, you get out of this barn, and you get in your car, and you drive to the hospital as fast as you can get there, and you tell the doctors that they need to test that child for botulism. He went to the hospital, they tested the child for botulism, it tested positive, and they were able to save the child, thankfully. This botulism can absolutely pass from the animals to people. Now, thankfully, we don't have the weather conditions like they do in Germany, so that it's chronic and acute both at the same time. But the low-level residue of glyphosate that is being found virtually everywhere that we're looking for. It's been documented to be in the air, the rain, and the rivers by a U.S. geological scientist, survey scientist. We're finding it in virtually every foodstuff that's being raised in a Roundup Ready production system. We're finding it in crops that are being raised after glyphosate has been applied to fields. It will be in the subsequent crops that the glyphosate is not even used on. And this is causing a tremendous disruption we believe this is causing a tremendous disruption and a wide array of different digestive problems on top of the foreign protein issues that the GMOs present.
And there is so much to talk about here because recently Monsanto showed this big boon of increase in profits, and a lot of that was like, I don't know if I'm quoting this right, but it was like a 30-something% increase in sales of Roundup was attributed to part of that. And you read about in South America where these crops are being grown, and a lot of these the peripheral areas and these small farmers and families are becoming sick, and there's birth defects. So and there are moms groups there who are starting to address this very issue. So go ahead.
That's been scientifically documented. Dr. Andres Carrasco conducted a scientific study on chick and frog embryos, and he exposed them to varying rates of glyphosate while they were in the embryo stage, and he was able to mimic the birth defects that he was witnessing of the babies that were born to the women who lived immediately around the Roundup Ready soybean fields that were being aerial sprayed with glyphosate-based herbicides. There's not any guesswork for us as far as the correlation in this birth defect. All synthetic chemicals have the ability to cause endocrine disruption. Now, the original toxicology information on glyphosate, they portray it as being fairly benign, but that's far from true with the science that has been conducted and the documentation that we've witnessed over the last 30 years. Roundup was first registered for use as a herbicide in 1974. And
well, also, Howard, isn't it true that they only tested the glyphosate and that Roundup is not just glyphosate? Roundup is a different thing. Did they actually test Roundup in these tests, or did they just test straight glyphosate?
well,
When they approved it?
I'm not sure. I won't say specifically on that, but the thing that we know has happened, the formulations of Roundup has changed 2 and 3 times since it was put on the market. And in one of the studies that Dr. Seralini conducted in France on Roundup, he documented that glyphosate caused infertility at 1/2 of a part per million. He documented that it caused endocrine disruption at 2/10 of a part per million. And he documented that the adjuvant, which is the POEA, the surfactant that they put with the glyphosate to make it work better, that was even more toxic than what the glyphosate itself was. So yes, Roundup is much more toxic than glyphosate is. And do we need to have a updated review of this? Yes, we do. Do we need to have it done by a impartial team of scientists? Yes, we do, because there's ample proof to document the fact that you cannot trust industry-sponsored research.
And I think what you were saying was it was the other ingredients in Roundup, and that's what Dr. Seralini had actually attributed to the findings in that controversial, which, depending on what you use that term, in his rat study, the findings that he was doing on toxology, and he found these other problems, the tumors and
the thing that you know, the people that call that study controversial,
yes,
are industry, the promoters of the glyphosate system. Those are the people that find it controversial. Dr. Hubert told me the other day, of the 210 scientists that have condemned that study, 100% of them have a conflict of interest. They either work for the GM industry or have significant sponsorship in their research from them. That is a breach of morals and ethics as a scientist when you don't declare that, when you make comments derogatory towards a research project similar to that Dr. Seralini conducted.
Yeah.
That study that Dr. Seralini conducted was not set up to identify tumors. It was not to be a toxicology study, but the fact that, and it wasn't designed as such, that was part of the criticism that it received, which would be true, but it wasn't set up to do that. When those instances happened, they very effectively and soundly collected that data and reported it, and it had an unbelievably sound statistical scientific finding that nobody could argue with. Now the industry says, well, you used the wrong kind of rats. Well, guess what? He used the same kind of rats the industry used to supposedly prove that these things were safe. So how can they say his rats were wrong when it was the same rat they had used to supposedly prove it was right? The industry studies are designed not to find a problem. They're either short-term in nature, and sometimes if they do accidentally run a 90-day study, they won't tell the truth about the results. That's been proven with what happened when the French Supreme Court forced them to turn over their data on the MON 810 corn. They said their study found that there was no harm when their own study when the industry's own study was analyzed by an independent scientist, they found 3 significant health issues in the study that the industry had conducted for 90 days on the animals. So they weren't telling the truth.
So Kathleen, did you want to comment on kind of the correlation that we're seeing? We're not saying it's causative, but there's a correlation and an increase in some of the things that in our health, in children's health, that we're seeing in children since the onset, since we started having genetically engineered crops.
Well, yes. I mean, that's one of the reasons I feel that labeling is so important. It's kind of like, for me personally, we went through some issues with our children showing autoimmune conditions. And our oldest was most hard hit by this. And it was, in the end, we found out it was a condition called PANDAS, which is called Pediatric Autoimmune Neurological Disorder associated with strep. And they're finding now that it can be linked not only to strep, but to other underlying infections that go undetected. That children's immune systems are shown to be weakened. Some of them are missing vitamins and minerals. And when this happens and there's underlying infection, sometimes it's totally symptom-free. You don't know your child has an infection, that they're carrying around strep or whatever. Throat swabs come out negative. They have no sore throat, no fever, no symptoms at all, which was the case in our son. He had several physicals, and the only way we discovered that he had an underlying issue was through blood tests. We found that his antibody titers were elevated, and we took him to 2 ENTs that looked at his tonsils and said, well, they're a little enlarged and there's some scarring, so there's a chance there's strep hidden deep inside there that you can't get to with antibiotics and you can't find with the swab test. So they removed his tonsils, and we put him on antibiotics, and he got better. And when the tonsils were examined, they were indeed full of strep. So when we got the strep out of his body, his behavior came back to normal. And he's happy and healthy now. He's just fine. But I started looking into diet as a way to build his immunity. And that's how I learned about GMOs. And, you know, from what we read and what we learned, we decided to try taking our boys off of GMOs in their food and see how they did. And sure enough, they've been healthier. And I've met several other mothers that have overcome conditions their children have, whether it's autoimmune or food allergies. Some of the mothers I know have autistic children who've seen great improvement through diet. I mean, pediatricians know this. This is like a standard, it's common knowledge out there that diet affects one's health. And so when I heard Howard speak about the animals falling sick and the problems with their stomachs and so on that he reported on, and the fact that that seemed to affect their immune levels, they needed additional antibiotics, it affected their behavior, and they had digestive issues. They had you know, ulcers and irritation around the stomach, and the stomach is the center of the immune system. So if, you know, the animals that are fed GM have these problems in their stomach because they're fed GM feed, and these problems disappear when the animals are taken off a GM feed. You know, this also includes problems like sterility in animals and late-term miscarriages. And I know lots of moms who've had those problems too. So I kind of put it all together in my head, and I said, well, this at least deserves closer examination, because as mothers, when we look around the classrooms, we can see that so many students are having food allergies or health issues. I mean, talk to any school nurse or any teacher who's been around for 20 years. They'll tell you there's been such a change in the population of children. Now there are issues like behavior, you know, ADHD, learning issues, you know, food allergies. All of these things are going on, and I feel like everyone's kind of just accepting it and not really asking what could the cause be. And when I heard from Howard that farm animals were having similar types of problems, and then in our own home we changed our children's diet and we saw improvement, and I met other mothers who've done the same thing and spoke with pediatricians who were aware of this, I thought, well, we just have to spread the word. So it's my opinion that we should fight for labeling, no matter what you believe, just because it's our right to know what's in our food and how it's produced. But it's my feeling that this is really affecting our population, and the children are like the canaries in the coal mine because they're smaller.
Yes, we need to have further study. That's exactly it. Correlations are correlations, but we need to have further study, and that's what we need to address. And Howard, you had mentioned earlier about the actual process of the genetic engineering, food, how they go about doing that, exchanging the DNA and doing these types of things. That is actually the process that's the problem. Can you expound on that?
Well, I guess the best way I would try to describe that is in one of the conversations I had with Dr. Pustai, you could take two plants and they would be identically the same. And you were going to take one gene out of the one plant and insert it in the other plant and use the genetic engineering process to make that insertion. So you're not changing anything as far as what would naturally be in that plant. You're just taking it from one and putting it in the other, and then you should have two of them in this one, right? Just that process of insertion and the disruption that it causes puts in place the development of a foreign protein in the fruit of that plant. It's these foreign proteins that is the number one culprit, we believe, in causing the immune system problems, the food allergies. Then you take on top of that and you add in all of the other increased use of the toxins, being the glyphosate and or other herbicides that you probably wouldn't ever use as a higher rate as they're being used on the genetically engineered crops. Well, now you add to the problem of the residues in the foodstuffs. So it's just, and Dr. Pustai, who was the first scientist in the world to really research this, was actually very optimistic and eager to see the benefits of this, because he thought it was going to be a really good thing. And when he received permission from his supervisors to go public with the results before his study was published, he was a hero for 2 days, and then he was literally destroyed after that.
Yeah. So, did you have a question, Lori?
Well, it's just that I found that I'm allergic to Brazil nuts now, and it wasn't until we had a talk earlier that I found out that they had done some kind of a thing with Brazil nuts and soy. Do you know about that, Howard?
I'm not real familiar with the Brazil nut thing, but the comment, the thing that comes to mind when you make your comment, when we were in California doing the presentations the first week of February, Zen Honeycutt told about one of her boys' carrageenan allergy. And the first time that he had it, it was a severe reaction that caused significant problems for him, and it lasted 2 to 3 weeks. After she learned about GMOs and purged the GMOs from her children's diet, her son was accidentally exposed to carrageenan again at a later time. It was the effect that it caused was very, very minimal compared to the first time, and that would coincide with what we have witnessed in livestock. When you take away all of the challenges of the GMOs, whether it's the foreign protein or the potential toxins in the feedstuff or whatever it may be, you find that you have more of a functioning immune system, and you're not as much at risk by something that may not agree with you. And the other thing that we have to consider, and there's so many cofactors that come into play with this, But glyphosate is used in a very wide variety of different food crop production systems. In the almond groves, for example, they will use that to kill all of the growth around the base of the trees. Well, they don't realize how devastating that is to the nutrient uptake of that tree as far as pulling nutrition from the soil, because glyphosate is such a tremendous chelator. And it's such a promoter of bad organisms, causing a host of diseases, because it kills the beneficial organisms in the soil and causes the opportunistic organisms to thrive. And the opportunistic organisms are the one that causes the diseases, whether it's in plants, in soil, plants, or animals, or humans.
So I want to jump back before I do have a question about that corn comparison study and the nutrient values. But just going back to the actual genetic engineering process, just want to clarify that for people, that's actually the big concern here, that you can say, I'm going to, with a potato and a wild potato, you're crossing, genetically engineering the two, that is the same as crossing a fish with, a tomato, that it's the actual process that is the problem.
Well, there's 2 points to answering your question. The process itself, as I've explained, when you take the same gene from one plant and put it in the other, that in itself is faulty. Now you add to that the potential development of even more foreign, allergenic, novel proteins. They're taking genes from completely unlike species. They're not taking one plant gene and putting it in another plant. They may take a gene from an animal, or a gene from the soil, or a gene from a plant into an animal, or an animal into a plant. And I'm a firm believer that the good Lord's the only one that knows how things are supposed to go together and be put together. And when man starts tinkering with it, he's going to do a good job of screwing it up more than anything else.
So can you discuss the nutrient differences that were in that corn study or data?
They're vast and stark. And what we know about the field that had the Roundup Ready corn in it, having been 10 years on a glyphosate-based herbicide program, glyphosate ties up nutrients wherever it's found. It'll tie up nutrients in the soil. It'll tie up nutrients in the plant. It'll tie up nutrients in the grain if they're present. The lack of nutrition in the feed and food supply is potentially just as devastating as the toxins in the food supply. Because if our immune systems are properly supported and we're taking in nutrients and foods that have a good balance of nutrition that are available, our immune system is designed to protect our body in a host of different ways. So you have a compound assault. First, you have a significantly devoid source of food. There's not nutrition in it. It's both caused by the use of the wrong types of nutrient sources in the crop production, as well as the potential tie-up of the nutrients when you have a chelator, a strong chelator like glyphosate present. So, Dr. Anderson terms it, he says, well, why do we have so much obesity in our country? We have foods that are full of hollow calories that have no energy in it. So you consume more carbohydrates in order to get the energy that your body is craving and lacking, and there's no nutrient density in the foods that are being produced in that mainstream system. So you're just eating bulk and not getting the support you need. And then when You throw in the foreign protein or you throw in the contaminant, then it snowballs. And the first effect is, oh, well, I don't feel good. I have to take some sort of medication to make me feel better. And then, oh, well, we've all seen the commercials on TV that says, well, you take this medication and they'll talk about the benefits. So maybe list 1, 2, or 3 benefits. How long does it take them to list the side effects? You know, the list is longer than your arm. Well, guess what? After you take this medication and you have all these side effects, you go back to the doctor and he says, well, take this one. That'll address the side effects of this and this and this. But it maybe only addressed 1 side effect and caused 5 more side effects.
So that it's just total conflict, total opposite of what the industry is saying, because I've heard it said that their GE crops are actually more nutritious. And that I can find that if I search on the internet, actual quotes of people representing the bio industry saying that it's more nutritious. So this data shows actually just the opposite. So I kind of want to go on to the atmosphere kind of the farmers out there, but I want to give Kathleen a chance to share some thoughts and if you have any questions.
I just have one more question, Howard. Please, would you go into the way that glyphosate could affect the immune systems of animals and people? Because I think it needs to be sort of spelled out how Roundup works to kill weeds, you know, by chelating their minerals, and then it leaves them susceptible, you know, the suppression of the immune system, how that works. And then also the BT toxins, that is the other way of raising these genetically modified crops, that they're antibiotic resistant and they're found to be thriving within our guts, human beings' guts. And so we're being attacked on 2 levels by, you know, our immune level is attacked by the glyphosate, potentially, and then you have antibiotic resistant bacteria thriving within your gut. So how could this be good for us? I mean, could you please talk about how Roundup works? Because in my mind, for me personally, that's a crux of my issue, because the issue in our household, in our family, was immunity, lowered immunity. And I think a lot of pediatricians are finding that children are having lowered immunity, and that's affecting them in different ways. And sometimes it looks behavioral, but it's based at the root at lowered immunity.
Well, and the behavioral is the result of the cause.
Right.
There's getting to be, thankfully, more and more studies that are documenting the fact that when you improve the diet, you improve the behavior. Dr. Huber told me the other day of he's taking EDTA chelation therapy right now to remove the buildup of plaque in his arteries. And the nurse told him they had a young child in there that was extremely bipolar, just diagnosed. They gave that child an intravenous treatment of nutrients and micronutrients, and they virtually wiped out all of those bipolar symptoms with that single treatment. Glyphosate is a strong chelator. Chelate is a Greek word meaning claw or to hold. Now you can chelate in a friendly manner, and you can chelate in a sequestering or an extreme fashion. I have an ink pen in my hand. Okay, if I chelate in a friendly way, that ink pen comes out. If I chelate in a sequestering fashion, I can't pull it out for nothing. That's what glyphosate does. It latches onto calcium, magnesium, manganese, zinc, iron, copper, nickel, cobalt, boron, selenium, molybdenum, and potassium. When it latches on, it doesn't let go. So by tying up those mineral nutrients, that initially challenges the immune system because that nutrient is not available. Now, you could have those different elements in the fruit of the plant that was raised in the system, but because of that strong chelating bond, that nutrition is not released and made available to whatever is trying to access those nutrients that consumes it. You couple that with the biocidal or antibiotic effects of the glyphosate. If you go to the U.S. Patent Office's website and do a search for patent number 7771736, you will see that glyphosate has been patented as an antibiotic. It takes a very, 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 very minimal amount of glyphosate to cause harm to beneficial organisms. It's that compound assault and attack of both that chelating effect and that biocidal or antibiotic effect that makes it such a potent product. The weeds will not die when they're sprayed with a glyphosate-based herbicide unless you have opportunistic organisms present. It will kill the good organisms. It will cause disease to grow as a result of the growth of the bad organisms. And it's actually the disease caused by the bad organisms that have to kill the plant. This has been documented numerous times. You spray a non-Roundup ready plant in sterile soil and it won't die. It'll just stall out for about 10 days to 2 weeks and then it'll start growing again. You spray a glyphosate-based herbicide with a fungicide that will stop the opportunistic fungi from increasing, and you will have no herbicidal effects of that glyphosate-based herbicide because the opportunistic fungi causes the disease that actually kills the weed. Well, the problem with this is as they continue to use that same mode of action, and this can happen with any herbicide, you use the same mode of action time and time and time again, they're going to build up resistance. But the unique nature of the glyphosate resistance is it's so broad spectrum in its chelating ability that when the weeds build resistance, they're not just resistant. They have become super weeds. There are 21 weeds worldwide that have been documented to have resistance to glyphosate-based herbicide. In the southeast U.S., they have something called an amaranth pigweed. It used to be 3 foot tall when it was full grown, and there would be 100,000 seeds on that plant. Today, they can get 10, 12 feet tall, and they may have 1 million seeds on that plant. I know of cotton and peanut farmers in southwest Georgia that have spent over $150 per acre to have hand labor come in and walk their fields and dig out these amaranth pigweeds by the root, because if they just cut them off, they'll come back. There's not a cocktail mixture of herbicide that they can use to kill these weeds if they're over 6 inches tall. Well, the ease and the convenience of the early herbicide-tolerant crops was the draw and the reason why this thing exploded like it did. Now today, these guys don't know if they're coming or going. They just know they have a major problem. And the only answer that the industry is offering is, oh, well, we'll bring you 2,4-D tolerance and dicamba tolerance along with the glyphosate. Well, the study that was just published out of Berkeley documented in the best case scenario, within 12 years of that system being implemented, we would then have weeds that were resistant to both those modes of action of herbicide, and in essence, they're going to accelerate the development of tougher super weeds with what they're doing.
Yeah, that just, go ahead, Lori.
So with these farmers who have been relying on this for so long, and say there's a farmer who's been doing that and he wants to switch over to something else, how does that work? What can he do to heal the soil?
We can actually do that quite effectively and efficiently, thankfully. The first thing that farmer has to do is look for a different source of knowledge and information in how he's going to go about doing what he's doing, because the mainstream system at this point in time, is not providing any answers.
Uh-huh.
The one thing I failed to answer in Kathleen's question was about the BT. The natural version of BT is not harmful to anything other than the insect it's meant to kill. And after it causes the explosion or disruption in the gut of the insect it's designed to kill, it's benign and it's no longer damaging. The genetically engineered version of BT has been documented to cause damage 9 months after the BT crop is dead. It's still having an adverse effect to beneficial organisms in the soil. So it's...
I think that's interesting is that people, I've heard it from the scientists' own industry, the bioindustry, saying that the BT toxin, and they compare it as the same as the BT that they apply in the organic industry. And that is like the most unscientific statement. And so I'm glad you just clarified that. But when you were mentioning earlier how what the appeal was to these crops to begin with was the incredible ease. It was very easy to grow these crops. You just spray it once or twice, and so that was sort of the draw. It was almost like it's too good to be true. Farming's hard, and I don't know if it'll ever be easy. But so that kind of gives me to the question on what is the atmosphere out there with farmers, and are there farmers who are switching over to non-GE, and is it possible for them to find quality seed stock?
The attitude.
Kind of the atmosphere right now. Do you find there's farmers who are wanting to leave this, or are they going to go ahead and do the 2,4-D and the dicamba? And
there's, I don't want to generalize this as all falling into one lump sum, but first of all, one way to describe it is the pendulum is on the way back. We have maxed out the concentration of the genetic engineering implementation in our country, and it's going the other way now. We're seeing most of the farmers know something is wrong. They don't necessarily know what's wrong, but they know something's wrong. Okay. There are a lot of them, if they're working with livestock, they're going to see it the quickest and benefit the fastest by switching. Some will say, well, I'm not having problems, but I know of one operation that said that they were very, very effective managers. They were using GE grain, and they were feeding their livestock, and they were keeping them healthy, and they were being productive, but they were using a tremendous amount of antibiotics to do it. When they switched off of the GMO corn in their feed, their antibiotic use dropped 85 to 90%.
Yeah, I think this is really important within the mothers community, because when our children get sick, you know, they tell us we need antibiotics, which we don't like to give to our children, A, and B, doctors are hesitant, you know, to give prescriptions because they say there's so many issues with antibiotic resistance. But from what I understand, 80% of all antibiotics produced are going to livestock.
Yeah.
Well, and that's those numbers are correct, but the thing that too many people don't realize, glyphosate's an antibiotic. Yeah. They're using it on virtually every acre of corn and soybeans in how many parts of the country? Or if they're not planting Roundup Ready crops and they're no-tilling, they may be using glyphosate as a burn down. Well, how could you draw up a plan to faster accelerate antibiotic resistance than to use antibiotics on the soil and the crops, along with using antibiotic resistant genes in the development of the genetically engineered crops? What more of a perfect storm could you draw up?
So we are going to have to wrap it up here pretty quick. So I kind of wanted to bring this back to labeling. And how labeling, without a label, there's no choice. And So we need a label, and that communication from is open from the consumer to the farmer. That demand is there, that they're able to hear it with labeling. And also, what are your thoughts on labeling, Howard? And then we'll go with Kathleen and Lori.
Well, first of all, labeling, Dr. Carmen is one of my good scientist friends, and she's an epidemiologist. And she illustrates the point of labeling like this. She's been brought in to investigate a cause of a anomaly in health, whether it's an increasing problem, an epidemic, whatever the case may be. The first thing you do is ask questions. So, could each of you ladies tell me how much chocolate you had to eat yesterday?
For real? I actually ate a chocolate.
Answer this question to yourself. Now, tell me how much chocolate you had 3 days ago. Tell me how much chocolate you consumed in the last week, and tell me how much chocolate you consumed in the last month. Now, you've got that answer in your mind, right? Can you tell me how much GMO food you have consumed in the last week? No, you can't, because you don't know. So, from the standpoint of conducting a good epidemiological analysis, you can't do anything because labeling is not there. Now, as soon as we have labeling mainstream, that will give more people the right to avoid the ingredients of the GMO. That will give us the tools to determine, yes, this is part of the cause. No, it wasn't. And if the industry is so sure that it's so safe, why don't they brag about the fact that it's there? Promote the benefits to people. Sell it on its merits. That's simple. Isn't that good marketing? Just tell us how good it is. You tell us all day long, be proud of it, put it on the label.
Kathleen.
Well, I think, for Washington State, I think that they're talking about the issue of exports, that a lot of countries around the world either, reject GMOs or they demand labeling. Because other countries' governments are looking into the safety of GMOs. Unlike ours, I think our government kind of just accepted the short studies that were run by these GM companies themselves, and they said, oh, that's good, and they said, okay, let's introduce it to the food supply. I find that problematic, but really for the state of Washington, the exports are an important issue to the economy. And whatever you believe on GMOs, if you don't figure out a way to regulate that, a lot of countries are just flat out rejecting any of our imports because they may have GMOs. Mm-hmm. So it really works against the farmers as well as the consumers not to have labeling. It's just our right to know how our food is raised. Even if I'm completely wrong, in my opinion, that GMOs could be affecting children's food allergies and autoimmune issues and women's pregnancy issues, that I think that it could be a contributing factor to all the health problems that we're seeing skyrocketing, diabetes and so on. I just think until there's more research, it's only fair that we have labels so that if we have questions, we don't have to buy it. I don't know why they should be able to sneak it into our food. I think as consumers, it should be our right to know exactly how our food is produced. Why shouldn't we know? And if we're not okay with a certain method of food production, we shouldn't be forced to buy it because it's hidden in everything. It's just not fair.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Lori.
I've got friends in Canada that I was going to have a hangout with. Well, I am going to have a hangout with. I've already done one interview that I'm going to be working on, and they're from the Millions Against Monsanto Toronto group, and they were talking. Well, they're going to have on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, April 9th, they're having marches in different locations in Canada. You can go to the GMO Free Canada Facebook page and find out more about that. And I'll put up a link on the Weekly Women's news group after this. But also there's another interview that I'm doing coming up with Arzina Hamir and April Reeves, and they're both working on labeling in different locations in Canada. And Arzina was telling me that in Canada they have a lot of places that, like at the municipal level, where they have banned use of Roundup, or well, actually pesticides just in general. And so they're working on it on that level, you know, in the local groups mostly. And they're trying to do things on the national level too. But Vancouver Island is going to be voting on going GM or GE free.
That's awesome.
The San Lori has already passed that.
Lori, okay, Howard, I want to thank you for joining us. That's great. You've been a lot of information for us, important information that consumers need to hear. So thank you for what you're doing, and we hope to have you on again.
Thank you, Howard.
Thank you
Thanks,
for what
Howard.
you're doing, and keep up the good work. We'll win this battle together. We'll win the war. We've got lots of little battles.
That's right. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. So, yeah. So we're just going to finish up here, but I just want to show the Food and Water Watch. It's a report on Monsanto. It's a company's profile, and you can go to Food and Water Watch's site, and it has a report on the company, its history. They're super fun sites that we taxpayers are paying for. So you want to get your copy of this, or you can just go on and you can just download the PDF online.
Good.
And thank you, Kathleen, for being on, and Lori, and then we look forward to our next show.
Yeah. Okay.
With Zen.
Right.
With Zen.
Yeah. Yes,
Rachel.
She's camping this week, so she couldn't
yeah, we lost connection there, so
Yeah.
she was going to host the show, so we ended up doing it on our own, and yeah, we'll have Leslie Stoddard and Rachel Linden. All right, thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.